All for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander.
Where are me crew?
Me crew.
Me jolly, jolly crew.
They're all gone for beer and tobacco.
Since the COVID came around and the pubs all they shut down, now I'm missing singing songs with you together.
Oh, it's all for me grog, me jolly, jolly grog. All for me beer and tobacco. Well, I spent all me tin with the ladies drinking gin. Now across the western ocean I must wander. Yes, across the western ocean I must wander.
Well, thank you, Jack, for that introduction. It's always delightful. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for First Friday. I have 3 quick announcements before we get started with this evening's program. Breaking news, the Customs House Maritime Museum is launching its business membership. You may have seen this newspaper article this week that announced that next Friday, April 9th, from 10 to noon, we will be hosting an open house for businesses. Last summer, the museum surveyed local companies to ask how can we assist their business and employees. The Business Membership Committee then interviewed 2 local museums, the Cape Ann Museum and the Peabody Essex Museum, to understand what their model was, their incentive, and to also learn lessons that they could advise us to avoid. So it was very helpful, and we're grateful for their time and their insight. There are 4 different tiers of benefits specifically catered to assist local businesses, and you can check out those costs and benefits on our business membership page. We are thankful to Mobile Global for becoming our first business member, and we hope others will join too. And thanks to Susan Bernhard, Jennifer Germain, and Tom Strickler for championing this initiative. We also have a new exhibit opening this month. Who knew that the U.S. Coast Guard has an art program where they lend out fine art as part of their educational outreach for the service? This program, federally funded and in its 35th year, has well over 2,000 works of art from amateur and professional artists who donate their time and work to help demystify the daily chores, training, and 11 missions of the Coast Guard. Come see the 7 paintings displayed in the central stairwell. My favorite is the water coffee. I believe the artist used several different roasts and strengths of coffee to paint the picture. The exhibit will be up until the end of the year, so please come. Typically, come May, we also revert our hours back to the summer, but given this particular spring and the opening up of the state, we decided to do a stepped format. So come May 6th, we will open the museum from Thursday through Sunday. Later in the month of June or closer to July, we'll look at the situation again, and we hope to open to 6 days a week. So be sure to check our website or call before you come. Of course, we will always adhere to the COVID regulations for capacity and social practices, and to wearing masks and keeping distance. Summer program is underway, and we remain hopeful that all will remain diligent to keep themselves and others safe. I actually met Dr. Kimberly Alexander in March 1999. She was the curator of the Architecture and Design collection at the MIT Museum. We overlapped a year or 2 before Kimberly left to care for and manage the Peabody Essex Museum's 8 to 10 historic houses. We often laugh that we just traded organizations. Later, I learned that she moved on to Strawberry Bank to care not only for the historic houses and structures, but their contents too. Like any career, it's a small world within your discipline. Now on faculty of the history department at the University of New Hampshire, Kimberly teaches museum studies, material culture, and American history. Her most recent book, entitled Treasures Afoot, Shoe Stories from the Georgian Era traces the history of early Anglo-American footwear from the 1740s through the 1790s. She's also curated several exhibitions. Well, actually more if you conclude all the previous organizations that she worked at. But recently, and very appropriate for tonight's lecture, Kimberly co-curated Fashioning the New England Family at the Mass Historical Society in October 2018. The 7-month exhibit explored ways in which fashion and fashionable goods not only define the individual, but they also reflect patterns of consumption, recycling, and even retaining their favorite family pieces. Just think baby clothes and wedding gowns. So tonight, you are what you wear, navigating New England's fashion and politics before the revolution. Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Jack Santos, and actually Sean Palmacher, who first reached out to me about this talk a very long time ago. So I'm very excited to meet with all of you this evening, even with the intermediary of Zoom. So if you just would bear with me for just a moment while I get my slides to share with you, and then we will be off to the races, as they say. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about navigating fashion and politics in New England in the 1760s and 70s, and sort of looking really at this decade as we approach the revolution and think more about what was actually happening in the time leading up to that. And fashion was a tremendous is a tremendous indicator, then as now, as we all know, of people's self-identity, of group identity, and of political identity. When the day came for the inauguration of both the president and the new nation on April 30th, 1789, George Washington himself wore a suit of chestnut brown broadcloth from a Hartford, Connecticut manufactory. And I'm showing you the image of what is believed to be that coat, which is in the collection of George Washington's Mount Vernon, of this coat made of cloth from Hartford, Connecticut. His new suit presented him as a man of Republican simplicity. It also represented the independence of the new nation. Just a few months earlier, in January of 1789, Washington wrote to his confidant and his former artillery commander, Henry Knox, about his interest in American-made fabric. And I quote, "Having learned from an advertisement in the New York Daily Advertiser that there were superfine American broadcloths to be sold at number 44 in Water Street," he wrote, "I ventured to trouble you with the commission of purchasing enough to make me a set of clothes." As in, end quote, as in all of his regular orders for clothes, and we have them going back decades through his written correspondence with his manufacturers and factors who would supply him with British goods, we know that he was incredibly exact in what he wanted. And Washington demonstrated in this request, as he always had, a remarkable and current knowledge of sartorial concerns, including important details about the fabrics, the textures, and the dyes. As to the color, Washington decided he would leave that up to Knox to decide. But he did also take pains to ask that Knox locate a fashionable London color, a fashionable color just out of London called London Smoke, for a habit for his wife, a riding habit for his wife, Martha. If Knox could not acquire the cloth in New York, Washington suggested that he get them from the Hartford manufactory, which he had read about. Now, Washington's attention to the political meaning of his attire for the new nation has been, in some cases, portrayed as something new. in this post-revolutionary period. But what I want to argue with my talk today is that, in fact, this was happening over 2 decades before this particular event, before the inauguration. So his attention to the political meaning of his attire for the new nation was evident, as I will discuss, at least through the 1760s. But before that time, the domestic production of textiles was a challenging and difficult thing for British Americans. Mostly comfortable or even eager to demonstrate their connection to England, they prized their access to goods made in England that were then shipped to America, or even goods that were made elsewhere in Europe, but still shipped through British channels. The sense of being a British American could cut across classes, and the colony's most powerful families would covet validation in their rightful place in this wider circle. And here I'm showing you Washington in his uniform that he actually designed. We have both a painting of him wearing the uniform and the actual ensemble, which survives at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And Washington, this is actually an account of him ordering shoes from a London shoe manufacturer well before the revolution named John Didsbury, where he is being very, very specific about what he is looking for. And here, there's a second jacket, which also survives at Mount Vernon, here in the blue. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, the buttons, even something as simple as the buttons on Washington's coat, were often snipped off and given away as souvenirs by later family members. But so consequently, by the mid 18th century, and there's a lot written about this by scholars about this consumer revolution that occurs in British America up through the 1740s and 50s. But by the mid 18th century, most British Americans saw no harm in indulging themselves in imported luxuries when they could afford them. And in fact, this would become, as the tensions increased between England and the colonies, this would become a very difficult habit, in fact, to break. There emerged this strong and deliberate effort starting in the 1760s that would try and encourage the colonials away from depending on English trade imports. The new import tariffs, and I'm sure you all are familiar with these, implemented by the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Acts, the colonists saw then an opportunity to use boycotts as a form of protest, recognizing that imports from cities like London and Bristol sent revenues to the royal treasury and to the crown. And they also recognized the value of shifting their purchasing power to domestically made substitutes in the colonies would put money into the pockets of their struggling neighbors, rather than the coffers of English merchants. And what I'm showing you here on the screen is an example of the sort of the height of luxury, sort of at this mid 18th century time that you might have found, whether it was in British America or in Britain, a man wearing a silk, woven silk waistcoat and frock coat, and even the detail of lace for the end of the sleeves. Or here, this is a reproduction of what was known as a silk banyan, based on examples out of India and China, that was remade or was created at the Colonial Williamsburg within the historic trades by the tailors. Here, green silk banyan would have been considered, our idea today of a dressing gown would have been the elite idea of at-home loungewear. I think in our pandemic era, this is not the sort of thing most of us think about lounging around in while we're writing and doing accounts, but you know, we can always try and bring things back, right? Here, a detail of much the same sort of finery that you would find on an elite woman. Here you've got both jewelry, lace, you have satin ribbons and bows and metallic gold lace trim. In here, I'm showing you two different examples of the types of elaborate handwork that would have adorned everything from a bodice on a woman or a waistcoat for a man. Above is what we call gold lace. It's actually spun gold that was then wrapped around a linen or cotton thread and then really treated as though you were actually making needle lace. And down below, you have what is probably the hem of a dress, which has then been embroidered with silver metallic thread and what were then known as spangles. Our equivalent would be sequins today. So these incredible amount of luxury on these foreign imports were seen as something at mid-century that was desirable. This will start to change, however, by the early 1760s. And we start to find in 1764, and again, this ties in with these various acts that taxes and tariffs that are being imposed by the British on these goods that British Americans want. But in 1764, for example, the Newport Mercury writes, whether we are not undone by fashions made for people, and whether it not be a madness for a poor people to imitate a rich one, whether a woman of fashion not be declared a public enemy, whether a lady who is set out in foreign silks and laces may not said to consume more beef and butter than 100 farmers. A few weeks after this piece in 1764, we find in the New Hampshire Gazette the announcement, advertisement that I'm showing you here, which says, whether the women may not sew, spin, weave, embroider sufficiently for the embellishments of their own persons, and even enough to raise envy in each other without being beholden to foreign countries. In this very same year, there's an initiative to begin an American society of to promote arts, agriculture, and economy. And in a statement that was printed up and down on the Eastern Seaboard in all the newspapers, there was very, very common to repeat the same announcements in different newspapers as the latest news. In statements printed, the group articulated its concern over the present state of the declining trade, the vast luxury that was introduced during the late war, meaning the French and Indian War, and the numerous restrictions on trade encumbered by the recent Sugar Act. This group invited every real friend and lover of his country, of whatever rank or condition, to join them in an effort to support local industry and to reject the craving for these luxury goods that had captured British Americans. This new society took off very quickly, and by December 24th of 1764, the readers of the Newport Mercury found the following: the subject of economy as a matter of unspeakable moment will be amply considered, and it is to be hoped some happy expedients will be discovered to check the progress of our luxury and extravagance. Now, this is also something that's very important because there starts to become this concern about luxury versus thrift as also having negative connotations in this context. So that having lace and what were known as fripperies and gewgaws attached to your clothing or as an integral part of it became seen as parts of superfluities of dress, things that Americans should not be interested in. And so you have both the economic incentive to work with local businesses, but you also now have this sort of more moral, ethical issue about shunning luxury and finery. And here, this is the part of the article that I was mentioning to you. If you take a look in Newport, they're saying, it is with pleasure that we hear some of the principal merchants in Boston have come into a resolution to curtail superfluities in dress. And upwards of 50 have already signed a certain agreement for this purpose. Lace, ruffles, etc. are to be entirely laid aside. This usual manner of expressing their regard for a deceased friend or relative by covering themselves in black, in other words, in mourning wear, we now will do just a small bit of crepe around the arm in the manner of military gentlemen. In 1765, we also find more advertisements appearing in the Boston, in Newport, I'm sure in Newburyport, we find it in Portsmouth, more advertisements about domestically manufactured textiles. And here I'm showing you one from a linen manufacturer in Boston, it was announced in the Boston Gazette. At the linen manufactory in Boston, there's been made within these last 3 months 400 yards of Bengals, Lilliputias, and Broglios, which have been bought by some of the principal ladies in this town for their own and their children's wear. And as the ladies have set the example, I hope the gentlemen will follow, as they may be supplied in the spring with several sorts of summer wear by John Brown. This is followed within another month or two by a major experiment taking place in Roxbury, Massachusetts. And I'm showing you here a detail of the advertisement as it appeared. A set of, and at this point, I don't know which Bostonians, I am still working on this part of the research, but a set of patriotic Bostonians invested in a Roxbury clothier who was poised to begin production in November 1767 in producing American-made broadcloths. This is tremendous, a tremendous both advance in terms of manufacturing, but also is moving very strongly into a conflict with Britain, because up until this time period, and still this work was being done outside of the agreements with Britain. The idea was the colony would send raw materials to Britain where they would be finished, processed, sewn, and then sent back. Now you have colonists who are actually starting their own linen manufactories, starting their own hat companies, starting their own shoemaking businesses. And as we can see here, starting to produce their own broadcloth for suits and suits of clothes. We are assured, and this is what the notice says, we are assured that a number of gentlemen have advanced considerable to a clothier in Roxbury, who is engaged to deliver in 3 months 10 suits of as fine homespun broadcloth as can be bought of the British. Now, this is important language too, because they are trying to let their potential purchasers know that this is quality material, and they can expect material that is as high quality or as fine as that which you would find coming from England. Later in the notice, it goes on to say, we've now learned that the southern colonies, as well as the people of New England, much approve of these late measures taken by this metropolis. Town meetings are called and calling to promote frugality and manufacturers. So again, you have these two tangents, frugality, thrift, and manufactures, industry, as the way to move forward, as the best methods to convince our master country of their mistakes, or save ourselves from a destruction that threatens us by saving our money. This is common throughout the newspapers at this time. And we have a wonderful example. This is a rediscovered document from a few years ago, found at Harvard University. It's a 1767 document. It has 8 sheets of subscriptions, and it contains more than 650 signatures of Bostonians pledging to participate in a boycott of English goods. And it includes, and I'm showing you a detail down below, many prominent Bostonians, including Paul Revere. And what you see on the left-hand side of the screen is a list of all of those items that are prohibited from purchase by those who are of a patriotic frame of mind. So this was an important rediscovery, and you can actually just, it's all been digitized. You can find this online. But so imagine this assembly taking place at Faneuil Hall Marketplace in October of 1767. Yes, people signed their names. Some signed, said they would only agree to it for 6 months. Some signed for an extended period of time. There were quite a number of women who signed as well. So it's a fascinating document, and it gives a real sense of where people's minds were, and also why Boston and New England were constantly such a thorn in the sides of the monarchy. There's also something else about this idea of meeting at Faneuil Hall. And I'm focusing on Boston here, but this could be Newburyport, this could be Portsmouth, this could be Newport. The main center of these cities and towns was incredibly circumspect, very relatively small, easily walkable. You could walk from one end of Boston to the other in about half an hour. So you were going to run into people. You would run into people, for example, on your way to Faneuil Hall for this meeting. You would run into people in the shops and so on. And so I'm going to ask you to think about just how this idea of geography also plays into some of the events as we know that they would play out. And I'm going to share with you a really interesting sort of vignette. This is from 1770, so this is a few years later. But this is a very interesting episode. And I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about Isaac and Mary Vibert. And this was an advertisement that was taken out by Isaac Vibert. And I'm just going to read this to you. Whereas some evil-minded person or persons did over this last week, the beginning of this week, post up a number of printed handbills in many parts of town, setting forth that Mary Vibert had purchased tea of William Jackson. So what is this? Tea, of course, at this point is not something that you're going to buy if you are somebody of a patriotic bent. This probably was done to raise resentment of the inhabitants and to injure me in my business, which wholly depends upon the employ of merchants and traders of the town in repairing vessels and so on. This is to inform the public that neither myself, my wife, nor any person for us have directly or indirectly bought tea or any other article from said Jackson since the vote at the meeting of merchants and traders the 23rd of January last. Jackson, of course, had allegiance to the crown. So the fact that somebody actually spent the time and money to put up post handbills around the city of Boston, and then that Isaac Vibert feels it necessary to take out an ad to clear his family's name, gives you a sense of just how volatile the atmosphere was at this point. And he actually offers to say that if anyone doesn't believe them, that he and his wife will both swear under oath before any magistrate. He further goes on to say that the occasion of Mrs. Vibert's going to Mr. Jackson's shop was simply to pick up a number of shoes from Lynn that were left there for her. Shoes from Lynn, Massachusetts. Why was that important? That shifts the whole conversation, because shoes that were made in Lynn were considered to be locally made and locally produced, that were a source of actually tremendous pride throughout the region. And while very few of the Lynn-made shoes during this time period were labeled, I'm showing you here an example of what they might have been like. This is a pair of Calamanco shoes, which is a wool shoe, a worsted wool. So the wool itself is forced through hot rollers. It's called calendaring, which gives it a bit of a shine and also makes it somewhat impervious to dirt and grime. And this type of shoe was very popular in New England, but relatively few examples have survived. Partly because they were often everyday shoes and they were just worn until they fell apart, and also because they are a delightful haven for vermin. And I know Joan can understand the difficulty of dealing with wool textiles filled with little moth holes and things like that. This particular pair is in the collection at the University of New Hampshire Museum, and are a very finely made pair of Calamancos. But so these might be the type of shoe that would have been coming out of Lynn that Mrs. Vibert was purchasing. But again, think about this idea of the walkable town, of Boston as this walkable community. Someone might have seen her going to pick up these shoes, which is probably why Isaac Vibert mentioned that at the end of his post. So these locally made wool shoes, Calamanco shoes, became synonymous with appropriate footwear for women who were embracing the patriot cause. An advertisement in Boston from January of 1765, the author wrote that women's Calamanco shoes, Lynn made, as neat and much stronger than any imported from England. So now you also have not only those that are just items that are competing with British sources, but now you're starting to hear the language, they're even going to be better than those that you could get from England. Oh, and here's the actual advertisement. Women's Calamanco shoes, Lynn made, as neat and much stronger than any imported from England. He also, the shoemaker lists there the price, which at 30 shillings, which would have been a very competitive price for these shoes. That same year and month, there's a Philadelphia shoemaker named Alexander Rutherford. And he goes even further in his advertisement, because he says his customers, he says those customers that are resolved to distinguish themselves with their patriotism and the encouragement of American manufacturers, that he makes and sells all sorts of worsted or wool shoes of all sizes, as neat and cheap as any imported from England. So this is a very common trope now that we're starting to hear, isn't it? The shoes that I'm showing you here, however, are not worsted wool. These are a brocaded silk. They're in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. These would have been very expensive shoes, and they were created by London shoemakers right out in Davis, and they're absolutely stunning. These are the shoes that you may see more of during this time period, the special occasion shoes, the fancy silk shoes, as opposed to the wool shoes. Now, of course, not all individuals, New Englanders, are going to be politically aligned with the patriot cause, as we know. In Boston, for example, the population of loyalists, the colonists dedicated with allegiance to the crown, included many prominent citizens. The families specifically transformed their fashion choices from mere displays of taste to political statements that matched the boldness that was expressed by the patriots. The Boylstons, the Byleses, the Olivers, for example, continued to purchase luxury British goods despite, or perhaps to spite, the non-importation agreements, the newspaper editorials, and their neighbors. They adapted to the political changes, purchasing from one another. And that's not surprising. Some of the research I've done in Philadelphia, you find Quakers will buy from other Quakers. We find in Boston, patriots are buying from other patriots. It's not that surprising. But when we can actually find links to those who were patriots and and what they were purchasing, or loyalists and what they were purchasing, it really expands the discussion and our understanding of what it was like when you passed somebody on the street. It may be lost on us, but you would have recognized if somebody was wearing something that was on the non-importation list, right? And here's a good example. This is Reverend Mather Byles. And Byles bought this pair of white kidskin leather gloves. These are in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society, even though these gloves were specifically forbidden in terms of the non-importation agreements. He bought them anyway. And he bought them from a loyalist. And I'm showing you here Mr. Inman, who was a wealthy merchant and continued to ply his goods from England. I don't know if you can make out the stamp here, but it actually says sold by R. Inman of Boston. And you can see it says finest kidskin from London. So these have survived. We know where Byles purchased them. We know who he purchased them from. We know they were both loyalists. And we know that Byles did not limit his expressions of loyalism to his consumer practices. He was unabashedly blunt in his criticism of the Patriots and rebellions. He was ultimately ousted from his pulpit. And his daughters continued to support the crown, celebrating King's Day, long after the Revolution, well into the first few decades of the 19th century. Another example, some of you may be familiar with the Oliver family. This is Andrew Oliver, who was a stamp collector. And I'm showing you here on the left a painting, and on the right side, the painting is in the National Portrait Gallery by Blackburn. And on the right is what we would call a sleeved waistcoat. You can see it's been dramatically altered for special dress. You can see from these sleeves there, but it's a figured silk with elaborate metallic embroidery. And the waistcoat is at the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's the same waistcoat that he's actually wearing in his painted portrait. So Oliver was actually, here's a detail, just so you can get a sense of the fine work and just how luxurious this is. Even down, if you take a look to that little lining of that beautiful salmon colored silk inside the sleeve, every little detail on this is perfect. Andrew Oliver, like other stamp masters in other towns, was burned in effigy. He actually, there's a terrific series for those of you who are interested in this time period that's currently being run by J.L. Bell, who does a blog called Boston 1775 and is published extensively. And he's just starting a piece about what happened when Andrew Oliver died. He died just as things were really heating up for the revolution. His family was so fearful that they did not, including his brother, did not attend his funeral procession, which was the norm, for fear of violence being done against them because of his unpopularity. Now, if you take a completely opposite example. I'm showing you here William Dawes. So we're going to focus for just a few minutes here on a fairly well-known patriot. So while some patriot families invested in both domestic and imported goods before the Revolutionary War, the record for William Dawes, who I'm showing you here on the left, and his family shows a deliberate and staunch interest in American textile production. Now, you may say, I know that name. You do, because he's known best as the third horseman of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Dawes might be considered a fashion sort of nationalist. For him, the what you wore, what you did, he measured life's endeavors against the moral worth of goods. Before his famous ride, his contemporaries would have known Dawes, like Revere, as a craftsman and a powerful voice in Boston's patriot politics. He grew up and apprenticed in Boston as a tanner and a leather worker, and he eventually kept a successful Boston shop. But the post-French and Indian War recession and the tariffs quickened his political consciousness. And so that struggling artisans like Dawes became much more radicalized sooner, perhaps, than some of their compatriots. In 1769, he added his name, and so this is early, 1769, he added his name along with those of other notable residents, such as Harbottle Dorr, Thomas Greenough, Paul Revere, John Scully, Ebenezer Storer, and Joseph Warren, to a very early non-importation agreement that committed the signers to forego manufactures of any type imported from Great Britain. On May 3rd of the preceding year, Dawes had married Mehitable May, and you can see Mehitable there in her lovely blue ensemble. He was 23 and she was 17. Now, while we don't know the details, the composition, in other words, the color, the textile, the cut, or any other details of his nuptial finery that day, an account book from his shop reveals that he could have pretty much had access to just about any type of good he wanted. However, there was an announcement in one of the Boston papers that said, and I quote, that he dressed wholly in manufactures of this country, wherein he did honor to himself and merits the respect of his province. So, end quote. So this is an early and strong political statement of the importance of wearing American-made cloth. And it's also interesting if you think back to where I started with Washington and 1789, and here you have Dawes, relatively unknown at that time, getting married. Normally, his wedding announcement would not have even been posted for someone of an artisan trade and background. It was because he was wearing clothes that were entirely manufactured in the country that it was noticed. And so this is a very, very important sort of turning point. This is a leather drawstring bag, pouch, document pouch, which survives at the Massachusetts Historical Society, quite likely something that was produced by him as a leather worker. And I'd mentioned to you earlier about the Roxbury outfit that was developing their own broadcloth. I don't have a link between Dawes's suit and the Roxbury creation of homespun broadcloth, but the timing is very much within the realm of possibility. So I'm trying to figure out, is it possible that Dawes got his the cloth for his suit from the Roxbury clothier, or if he in fact invested in this. Unfortunately, I've not yet found the name of the company, so it's a little more difficult. If anybody has any leads, please let me know. The ardor with which William Dawes committed to the patriot cause is evident in his acts: the midnight ride, the wedding outfit, the non-importation agreement. And that commitment had a long wake within his family. His descendants continued to embrace the importance and significance of production of textiles throughout the region long after he died. And what I'm showing you here is a wonderful piece, again, in the collection at the Massachusetts Historical Society, of a hand woven with indigo, probably a neckerchief or perhaps tablecloth, hard to say, that was created by his oldest daughter in her home weaving shop in Keene, New Hampshire, in the early decades of the 19th century. And it's monogrammed by most likely Lucretia Dawes, who was her sister. And this also survived. A note about collecting: the fact that this relatively ubiquitous and simple piece of of hand-loomed cloth survives, and that the family held on to it and then donated it to the Massachusetts Historical Society, says something about how significant this neckerchief or table covering was to the family. And there are a number of pages from Hannah Dawes' daybook that talk about her paying people to come in and weave textiles and make yarn and threads, for example. While loyalists continued to purchase British-made goods because of their political principles, many New Englanders who supported the move towards domestic production still purchased British imports right up until the time of the Revolution. Personal taste and the desire to look fashionable and genteel continued to be powerful motivators. And I'm showing you here one of the best examples I've found, which is John Hancock, who was a tremendous patriot and which we're familiar with. And here he is buying a pair of Lynn Calamanco shoes for his serving girl, Velate, in 1775. And Isaac Bassett was one of Lynn's best known shoemakers. So you have John Hancock, but this is what's interesting. He's buying a pair of locally made Lynn shoes for his household staff. While he's in Philadelphia, he buys a London-made pair of shoes for his fiancée at that time, Dorothy Hancock. And he writes about having these shoes made securing these shoes and having them sent to her. And this is right in that 1775 time period, right before they get married. So none of it is as clear cut, perhaps as we might like it to think it would be. So you have many British Americans who are still trying to identify with the culture and the society that they know well. One of the things that I found in my research, whether looking at clothing or shoes, and that is sort of supported in some of Benjamin Franklin's words, is that a tremendous percentage of articles, certainly of shoes anyway, were altered, repaired throughout this revolutionary time rather than buying new ones, either because they did not have access to local shoemakers, or because times were tight, or you just made do. And Benjamin Franklin talks about that during the repeal of the Stamp Act testimony in England, where he says that Americans will make do, they'll repair their old clothes until they can make new ones. However, the work that went into developing, and this is another thing that I think is rather key, the work that went into developing these manufactures, the linen manufactories, broadcloths, wool carding, shoe production, were actually all laid out by the time of the Revolution. They had to stay largely dormant during the war. But after the peace had been negotiated, these businesses were ready and willing and able to get started. And I think that that's one of the reasons we see things moving forward so quickly. So I want to thank you all so much for inviting me to talk to you tonight. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I'm just going to stop my screen share and I'll join you in just a moment.